Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Duesterberg, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and I'm pleased to be joined today by two distinguished senators who are leaders in the congressional effort to address supply chain vulnerabilities, which have been accentuated by several developments in recent years. One, obviously, the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic on the overall economy. And the other is perhaps the challenge of the economic behemoth in China. So we're going to discuss specifically a bill on critical supply chains that the two senators have jointly co-sponsored, but also address some of the wider issues that are in play here. So let me give a brief introduction of our panelists. First, Senator Bob Casey is a native of Scranton, Pennsylvania, graduate of Holy Cross University. His first job was teaching and coaching in elementary school. From there, he went on to law school at Catholic University here in DC. He had a distinguished career in state politics. He was Attorney General in the state of Pennsylvania and treasurer of the state of Pennsylvania. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006 and continues to serve. He's a member of the Finance Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and he's the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Aging. And from the other side of the aisle, we're pleased to have Senator John Cornyn, who's a native of San Antonio. Senator Cornyn has an extremely distinguished career after graduating from law school. He was a state court judge. He practiced for a while. He was a state court judge. He was Attorney General in the state of Texas and a judge in the state Supreme Court. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2002, and he served as the majority whip from 2014 to 2018. John also serves as on the Finance Committee. He's the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of the Finance Committee, also on Judiciary and Intelligence. So the two senators are the authors of the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act. Let me turn first to Senator Casey and ask you, Senator, to explain a little bit about what this bill does and why you think it was necessary to pursue this.
Well, Doctor, thank you. Great to be with you and your team at the Hudson Institute. And I'm always grateful to be with John Cornyn, not only on this bill, but on other things we work together on. Let me just start by setting forth what I think so many Americans have confronted when it comes to this terrible pandemic. We all of us, no matter where you live, no matter where what job you had or what position you were in, all of us, I think, were horrified, not just by, and are still horrified by, not just the gravity of this pandemic, but by some of the challenges we faced at the very beginning. And you know you're in trouble when access to masks and gloves and gowns, as well as even ventilators, are in short supply. And there were so many of those critical supplies that were necessary for the kind of response we needed in those early days. But that supply had dried up due to supply chain delays originating in China. At one point, the Chinese government even tightened restrictions on the export of masks and other personal protective equipment. So we had to learn the hard way. One way, and it's among several steps obviously we need to take, but one way to deal with that in the future more expeditiously is to pass legislation like John Cornyn and I have worked on. In this case, it's called the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act. It's Senate Bill 1854, 1854. We introduced it back in May, and it's noteworthy for a number of reasons. I'll start with bipartisanship. Senator Cornyn and I, and as well as two other Democrats and two other Republicans, Senator Stabenow, Senator Rubio, Senator Kaine, and Senator Tillis, it would establish a process to screen outbound investments in the offshoring of these critical supply chains, but only and limited to foreign adversaries like China and Russia to ensure the resiliency of these critical supply chains here in the US. It would require companies to disclose before they offshore national critical capabilities to foreign adversaries. The review process that's set forth in the legislation is designed to identify vulnerabilities so that we're not in the position we were in when it came to something as basic as personal protective equipment. The result of the work of the committee would be to provide recommendations to the president, and it emphasizes remedial action, such as to support domestic industry, like increased R&D or utilization of manufacturing institutes, or identifying trade dumping or subsidies, among others. It encourages supply chain diversification, but the bill is very limited in scope. It only covers, as I said before, foreign adversaries like China and Russia. It is limited in its purview, looking only at these national critical capabilities. So I'll leave it at that for now. There's more to talk about, but that's kind of the basic outline of the legislation.
Senator Cornyn, would you like to comment on your motivation for pursuing this bill, and also any other details on how the bill would work if passed into law?
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with Hudson Institute with all of you and my friend Bob Casey. The fact that he was an elementary school teacher and coach explains a lot about his temperament, and dealing with us, an obstreperous group of senators in the United States Senate. But I'm always glad to work with colleagues who are interested in solving problems, and that certainly defines Bob's approach, and I appreciate that. I won't add a lot more, except to say that COVID-19 has exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. In addition to PPE and ventilators that Bob mentioned, obviously the global semiconductor shortage has threatened manufacturing of everything from cars to advanced fighter jets. Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, and I introduced the Chips for America Act to try to address that problem and to encourage reshoring of semiconductor manufacturing. And the good news is we passed the Senate, and now we're waiting and hopeful for action in the House to help us there. But there's nothing, like Bob said, to deal with the outbound investments, and we have very little visibility into what those investments are or how they may affect critical capabilities that we need here in America, and to shore up a vulnerability on those supply chains. I'll give you one example that's of some concern to me. A venture capital firm based in California is the largest shareholder in Paradigm, an artificial intelligence company in China. That company is a contractor for the People's Liberation Army ground force, providing command and control of artificial intelligence software. So here you have an American company investing in China's military capabilities, including a means to keep track of its citizens in what has turned into a virtual police state, where every movement is followed, and people are given scores based on their compliance with the PRC's, the Communist Chinese Party's dictates. And obviously China is the one that looms the largest because of its aggressive efforts, both the economic and from a national security perspective. Again, we've done things like the CFIUS reform, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, but those have to do with investments by foreign countries into the United States, primarily with startup companies that produce dual-use technology that can be used for the military. As you know, there is a law in the PRC that any private sector technology has to be shared with the People's Liberation Army, their military and national security apparatus. So obviously that's a concern. But this takes care, or tries to at least get us started, to give us some visibility into those outbound investments. This bill is not intended to be a protectionist measure. We're not trying to stop trade with China. Trade is essential to our healthy competition with China. But just as maybe one little vote of encouragement, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission has recently included this legislation in its annual recommendation for Congress. So our efforts to try to make sure that the competition we have with China is fair and square, and not based on either inadvertence by U.S. investors in China into critical capabilities, or strategic investments by China in the United States that can be leveraged for their national security competition with the United States, or to bolster their economy.
Okay, before going into more details on how the bill works, let's maybe do a little bit of inside baseball here and just ask you to comment on where the bill stands in the process of getting through the Senate, and hopefully the House as well. Senator Casey, would you like to comment on whether you see this moving in the near term as either alone or as part of another piece of legislation, perhaps the comprehensive bill on China that's been talked about?
Yeah, Tom, as you know, in the Senate, at least these days, most major legislation, or even legislation of any kind, passes as part of some other, what I call a moving vehicle, depending on what it is. John and I have worked hard to try to find that pathway, and we're still working to get that done. Part of the challenge as well is we have to have a House measure to get through the House. But there is an upcoming opportunity when, as many of your members know, the Senate came together, and John was a big part of this, on the so-called USICA legislation, the U.S. Competition and Innovation, or actually Innovation and Competition Act. That got through the Senate a while ago. We want the House to take action as soon as possible. I hope that's January. And as part of that effort, we're hoping that might be a pathway to get our bill considered as part of that. But we will seek out any readily available pathway to get this done. And I think it's critical that as we're responding to the challenges posed by not just the pandemic's very specific challenges, but just generally the challenges posed by China. And of course, when you're talking about China, you're talking about the Chinese Communist Party and all of the challenges presented by their efforts, which can make it terribly difficult for, if not impossible, for our companies, our workers, to compete on a level playing field. So we're going to continue to work in the Senate to get it passed, as well as to work with colleagues in the House.
Senator Cornyn, the United States has developed lots of economic ties with China over the course of the years, and some companies, a lot of companies are producing there. The auto companies, our semiconductor companies have gone into some partnerships with Chinese companies, lots of technology companies. You mentioned artificial intelligence. So there's a nexus of relationships. And I wonder if you could comment on what kind of a reaction you have gotten for this approach to outward bound screening from the business community, because there's always going to be, probably always going to be opponents to this sort of approach. Yeah. But could you just comment in general about the reception you've gotten from your introduction of the bill?
Well, obviously, we can't expect the U.S. business community to ignore the huge market that is the People's Republic of China. But as we both said, we need to be attentive to what is being invested in China and what we are not making or building here in the United States because of the vulnerabilities that COVID-19 has exposed. But I think that's why this bill takes a rather modest approach in just requiring visibility into a rather narrow set of critical capabilities so that we understand exactly what's happening. I think there's been some apprehension by some of the business community about what we are trying to do. But I think as we explained the rather modest objective of this system, I think people let their guard down a little bit and said, well, that's not so bad. That actually sounds like something that's important that we do. But obviously, this is not just an economic issue. This is a national security and public health imperative. Obviously, I'll just tell you, when I talked to my governor when COVID-19 hit, I said, what do you need? He said, I need two things. I need testing and I need PPE. And the fact of the matter is personal protective equipment was not being made in the United States, and China, there's some suspicion China delayed announcing to the World Health Organization and others that COVID had been discovered in the Wuhan province so they could garner as much of that PPE for their own needs. I'm not judging that or whether that's true or false, but it does demonstrate a vulnerability for some of the things that we do need here in the United States, that we need a ability to get some insight into what those supply chains look like and to assess whether those represent an unacceptable vulnerability or not. But we're continuing to work with the business community and to try to make sure they understand it. I know that I've had some conversations with some semiconductor manufacturers who make investments in China, and they've made clear to me they understand that any investments they made there cannot basically compete with the most cutting edge semiconductor manufacturing that now we rely on Taiwan to produce. So we're going to have to manage this, but the first step, I think, is to get visibility into what's going on, and then we can try to have a more factual discussion about what's necessary and what represents maybe something that we don't need to do. But right now we'd be shooting in the dark.
Okay, well, let me pursue that just a little bit, Senator Casey. There's some of the other China bills on the import and export side have been criticized as being too broad in sort of a blunderbuss approach. If I read it correctly, your bill would set up a process of study of what and delineation of what critical capabilities are. But then what would trigger action to perhaps block or mitigate the impact of critical capabilities that are defined by a interagency committee? How do you delineate that and limit the applicability of the potential sanctions or restrictions?
Well, Tom, it's a good question, because at first the committee would be established, that interagency committee that you made reference to, and I won't go through the membership of that, but it's a significant membership of federal government agencies. But firms that operate in these critical industries, and just by way of a kind of a quick summary of what those kind of the broad strokes on that. When we talk in this bill about national critical capabilities, we're talking about systems, services, assets that are vital to our U.S. national security. So that could be agricultural, it could be health security, homeland security, energy, natural resources. But these firms would have, based upon the legislation, that any firm operating in those areas of critical capabilities would need to report outbound investment to certain foreign markets. For example, China, a non-market economy and clearly an economic competitor. Some would even say, I would say, an adversary. And the firm would also have to report how that might compromise U.S. national security. Now, the committee, under those circumstances, which are rather limited, would have the ability to block certain outsourcing activities while undertaking a review of the transaction. Ultimately, what would happen is recommendations would be made by the president. We even set forth guidance in terms of factors to be considered both by the committee and by the president. What we don't want to have happen here is just a kind of a cursory review of an investment. We want to make sure that we're focused on vulnerabilities, and we want to focus, of course, on our own national security. And that's why I think those engagements that Senator Cornyn made reference to with the business community are critically important. We're having one right now as part of this dialogue. But whether it's the Hudson Institute or whether it's in my case, a couple of months ago, appearing before the U.S.-China Business Council, who raised a lot of questions that we were answering at that time and have answered since. That's why it's important to have those conversations. I will say this: Senator Cornyn made reference in his opening comments about the work done by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which is a highly respected organization, a commission that on an annual basis is reporting on challenges posed by China and kind of the state of play. In their annual report, they recommended legislation just like this to set up an outbound investment review mechanism, which we do not have now, which I think exposes us, not just in the limited circumstance that we made references to with regard to PPE and a pandemic, but more broadly, when you have that integration of activity of our firms with actions taken by the Chinese Communist Party to threaten us, we want to make sure that we can prevent that kind of intermeshing from happening.
So I wonder if we could move the discussion to a little bit broader scale. This week, I believe, is the 20th anniversary of the entry of China into the World Trade Organization. I think it's not a controversial statement to say that most people think that if not a mistake, at least didn't end up achieving the goals that the supporters thought it would achieve, which is for China to become a responsible stakeholder and a constructive member of the, for lack of a more precise term, the liberal trading order, liberal trading system. Now, in recent years, perhaps started by the Trump administration, but not undone by the Biden administration yet, stronger actions have been taken both on the import side and now your approach on the outbound investment side. Some people will accuse those who are hawks on China of saying we want to decouple from China. Where do you, Senator Cornyn, come down on the whole issue of decoupling? Should we just throw in the towel and say this is not working and take as many actions as we can to become more self-sufficient? The Chinese, at least if you believe their rhetoric, seem to be moving in that direction themselves.
Yeah, they were the Made in China 2025. They certainly want to become self-sufficient in a number of technologies and areas, so they are not as tied to the rest of the world. I said a little earlier that nobody's asking any American business to forego one of the world's largest markets in China. And I think decoupling certainly is not our goal here. We're trying to be fairly surgical and to identify a problem and then provide some way to get to make a facts-based assessment of the risk, and then to take the minimum necessary steps, including mitigation, as opposed to just blocking a transaction. Again, sort of the reverse of what CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment, does here in the United States. I don't think we're on any inevitable collision course with China, but while we were focused post 9/11 on the war on terrorism, they certainly got very aggressive and have changed their whole attitude. And whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it comes to cyber, whether it comes to rebuilding or building their nuclear capability in their military, certainly their belligerence we see in the South China Sea, their threats against Taiwan. This is a new Chinese Communist Party under President Xi. And so I think it calls for responsible steps to try to make sure that we understand what they're doing, and we eliminate vulnerabilities where we can, because as we've seen with PPE, something as simple as that, whether it's semiconductors, something as much more complex and involved than PPE manufacturing, it's the only responsible thing to do to try to identify those supply chain vulnerabilities, and particularly when it becomes a national security or an economic security imperative, to take steps to protect ourselves in this competition. But China's, I don't think, you mentioned the World Trade Organization. I think it was maybe a little overly optimistic to think that somehow China was going to become part of the rules-based international order, because they don't play by the rules. We know that's true, particularly when it comes, as I mentioned, to intellectual property. And certainly they're not obligated to conduct themselves in the same manner as other countries like the United States that adhere to the rule of law. The rule in China is the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi. And it seems like they are going to, we need to find ways to protect ourselves economically and from a national security perspective, and to defend ourselves as we continue in this competition. So this is not as simple as some people might suggest, decoupling. I don't think that's desirable nor feasible, but certainly in these critical capabilities, as Bob said, defining those, identifying where those vulnerabilities are, and trying to strategically and surgically address those through some appropriate measure seems like the right way to go.
Okay, Senator Casey, would you like to comment on that?
I think John said it well. I think that it's not in any way practical, nor would I think most people recommend it. We're in a competition. This is part of the so-called great power competition. What we have to be mindful of, though, is it's not competition in the American sense, where there's for the most part, a level playing field. This playing field is not level when you have one country that, as John made reference to, is not playing by the rules. I mean, I've said it an awful lot, and I probably said it as much in the last couple of years before, which is when China cheats, Pennsylvania loses jobs. And I think that's been true, especially in terms of exponential job loss since 2001. So this unfortunate anniversary, I think, is testament to that. But it is a competition, and we just have to be mindful that when you're dealing with a group of firms in another country that has the backing of the Chinese Communist Party, it's not going to be fair competition. So we've got to insist that that level playing field is there and that there's fair competition. I think we will always have an advantage in terms of our workforce, in terms of the innovation that Americans can bring to every economic competition, and we just have to make sure that we're building in safeguards so that our companies can compete and our workers can compete. And I think too often some people will shrug their shoulders and think, oh, well, this is just the way it has to be. It doesn't have to be this way. We have to deal with China as a competitor that has built-in advantages for their companies and their workers. But I think we're starting to move in the direction of making sure that we put workers at the center of this challenge and make sure that our companies can compete. So one of the ways to do that is to make sure that they don't steal and undermine our national security, capabilities that would undermine our national security, and put in place the kinds of structures that we know we can to not just compete on a level playing field, but to actually win.
Well, perhaps as a final part of this conversation, I'd like to ask a question about whether or not we need some more help from our allies in addressing the challenges that China presents to us. I mean, they're both economic and increasingly national security challenges as well. Both of you, in your statements over the last year, have called for more cooperation with our allies. And Senator Cornyn, I know specifically on the trade front, you've called for the United States to join the Asian trade agreement that was negotiated originally as a trade Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now has the longer title of Comprehensive and Aggressive Trade Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So my question is, we've had trouble getting the Europeans especially to go along with us. Is there more we can do to work with our allies in Europe and in East Asia and South Asia? And how would you specifically go about that? We have this trade agreement, but we also have now with the Europeans, the Trade and Technology Council. Should we be optimistic that these will help us to work with our allies and actually be in a better position to induce China to change its behavior?
Yeah, I think we made a mistake when we did not, during the Obama administration, take up the Trans-Pacific Partnership for the very reason that you mentioned. One thing we have that China does not have is friends. And we've got a lot of them in Asia who are very concerned about the rising of China. I was just recently over the Indo-Pacific and was able to visit a number of those, number of countries there, including Taiwan, including India. As you know, the recent development of the so-called Quad between Australia and Japan, the United States, and India, I think is a good start for that. Senator Carper, the senator from Delaware, and I on the Finance Committee have written a couple of op-eds saying we missed the opportunity on the TPP, but let's revisit that again for the reasons that you mentioned. That is our where we have a comparative advantage with China, so it makes perfect sense for us to work with our friends and allies against this common concern in China. So we're seeing more concerns being raised by the EU and others about China's activities, both in the South China Sea and in Taiwan. And I think, again, this is our greatest asset. I think it would be a mistake to just view this as a bilateral competition between the United States and China. We need all of our friends and allies to join us in deterring China from aggressive military action, let's say in Taiwan, and we need all of their help in order to leverage things like export controls, things like our CFIUS program here, which many countries are now modeling after what we did here in Congress a few years ago, because they share the same concerns and the same vulnerabilities. So yes, I think working together makes enormous sense. And I'm encouraged by actually what we're seeing. I just wish it were happening faster.
Senator Casey?
Yes, Tom, I think that it might be that the pandemic, which unfortunately, with all of its horror and death and devastation, was shining a light on a number of problems that we may have been aware of before, but maybe not to the extent, or didn't fully understand the gravity of some problems. And one of them is just the idea that China, on a lot of days, unless we take action, has us over a barrel too often. And we don't want to put ourselves in that state of vulnerability again. So that's why this legislation, as well as the so-called USICA legislation I made reference to earlier, is critical. And that's why we're going to be talking about a whole series of measures to deal with the reality, the economic threat that China poses. And unfortunately, it doesn't end with just an economic threat. This challenge is really a national security threat as well. I think that's been evident to us. I think it's also much more evident to our European partners. John is right. We have to do this with friends, with our allies. I do think that recently this agreement negotiated by the administration, and I want to commend especially Secretary of Commerce Raimondo for her work on this so-called Section 232 steel and aluminum agreement. That was negotiated between the United States and the EU. And I think that's a good template to continue to have efforts made that are where we can come together to deal with these new realities. That's not the kind of agreement you would have been able to strike even a few years ago, likely. So we do have to invest in resources and invest in diplomacy. But I do think our European partners are much more aware of the threat posed by non-market economies generally, but in particular, the ultimate non-market economy, which is China. We are seeing European partners take, I think, a stronger stand against China. John was outlining some of the manifestations of what we're all more aware of now, I think. But unified efforts to impose sanctions on the Chinese government for its abuses with the Uyghur Muslim minority, a greater engagement with Taiwan between and among countries beyond just the United States, and this European Commission Global Gateway Infrastructure Plan is, I think, further evidence of that. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but we have to continue to build these elements of our alliances to confront more aggressively and more effectively the threat posed by China.
Okay, well, it's encouraging to an observer to see this bipartisan agreement on the direction of change and many of the specifics. You all have been working late. I don't want to take too much more of your time. Is there any further comments you would like to make before we wrap up on the general subject or the more specific subject of your bill? Senator Cornyn, any sort of final remarks?
Let me just say thank you to you and the Hudson Institute for hosting this. Sometimes one of the biggest challenges we have of actually passing legislation is people not exactly understanding what's in it. And they may regard it as a threat or something disadvantageous, but there's nothing like the facts to be able to combat misunderstanding or even disinformation when it comes to legislation. But so you all have provided us a forum in order to address some of these. I'm sure we're going to continue to have more conversations and more discussions about this. I agree with Bob that I think our best shot at getting this done is going to be on this. We started out calling it the Endless Frontiers Act here in the Senate. Now it's called USICA. Maybe it'll be called something else before it's finally passed and signed by the president. But I think the intent is good and it's important. And I agree with Bob that one of the very few good things that came out of COVID-19 is it exposed some of these vulnerabilities and perhaps prompted us to take action faster than we could and that we did previously. So thank you again for giving us the opportunity, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you and others who are interested in this competition, this great power competition with China.
Senator Casey, any final words?
Yes, Doctor, thank you for being the host of this and moderator, and grateful to the Hudson Institute. I want to thank John for working with him, his working relationship on this bill, and as is true of other issues we've worked on. And I'm grateful that we have a bipartisan group, as I mentioned, 4 other senators in addition to the work John and I have done. So I encourage folks who, if you haven't done it before, to take a look at this bill, Senate Bill 1854. It's not quite 25 pages, so it's digestible. But take a look at it, and if you have suggestions or recommendations, we want to hear those. We hope that we can pass legislation in the next really the next couple of months. I hope even in the month of January. We're always an optimist around here, but we're grateful because this is one of the many steps I think we have to take to deal with threats to our supply chains, threats to the good old American innovation that we can bring to bear on any problem, any challenge. But we don't want to have our national security undermined or compromised. We don't want to be, to use my imprecise language, over a barrel when it comes to something as basic as personal protective equipment. We should never, ever allow that to happen again. And I know there are a number of steps to get there, well beyond just the pandemic related issues, but this is one of the steps we should take, and I look forward to working with folks to get this done. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you for taking time out of your day. It's a very busy time of the year for you, so we deeply appreciate it. And I'm sure our audience will appreciate the insights that you both have given us about supply chain vulnerabilities and the competition with some of our 21st century adversaries. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.